Is it? Well, let me get set up here. "1914 was a really hard year. I wasn't there to know, but think about it. Times have been prosperous for years. If you were in 1914, there was lots of work, lots of progress, lots of things had been invented, like electric lights and cars and airplanes. Lots of progress had been made, and then in April, what happened in April? The Titanic sank after hitting an iceberg in 1914. And that was a blow because the Titanic was another technological advance, but it didn't work out. Didn't get halfway. Well, it got halfway across the ocean, but didn't make it all the way. And then in August, what happened in August?
The Archduke of Austria
Right.
and his wife
Were assassinated.
Incredible series of events.
And it's the events afterwards that really brought, bad news for the Archduke and his wife, but it's the events afterwards that really made 1914 a difficult year because all of Europe wound up at war once again. It had been a long time since there'd been a war, really almost 100 years. But now, all across from Russia towards the west, there was fighting going on, and it had more or less turned into a stalemate. There wasn't any big advances anymore. There had been some that were stopped here and there, and by Christmas time, it was just stuck. Soldiers in trenches, firing away at each other, a lot like in Ukraine right now. Stuck, firing away. And it was cold and muddy. And then, Christmas Eve, something happened. It had been a difficult year, but the Kaiser Wilhelm, the leader of Germany, he'd sent Christmas trees to all the troops. They probably would have appreciated some hot soup or maybe less healthy alternatives to take their mind off their problems. But anyway, he sent Christmas trees because he thought that would encourage the soldiers. And so on Christmas Eve, the soldiers had their Christmas trees, the German soldiers, many of them, and they began to sing Christmas carols. They sang the one that we just sang. I don't know if you guys were here in time. We sang Silent Night, Holy Night a few minutes ago, which is, of course, a German Christmas carol. And time went by, and of course, on the other side, at least in Belgium, on the other side of the trenches were British soldiers. The German soldiers somehow, in their singing, inspired some British soldiers to sing. And one thing led to another, and the German soldiers invited the British to come out, and of course they thought it might be a trap. And then finally one brave says, well, listen, you come out halfway and I'll come halfway. And over the next few hours, the war stopped. And let's see here. I brought something to read. I've told you the story, so I guess I don't really need to read the story anymore. But lots of things happened. I wish I could. I don't know what happened to my paper here. Let's just see if I can find it. Because over the years since that time, many diaries have been found, or letters that were written by British soldiers or German soldiers back to their families have been found that describe that event. The soldiers got out, shook hands, and realized that they were all just young men in a difficult situation. Let's see. Let me see if I can find you one of the letters here. Other diaries, let's see. They tell some things that happened. A fellow named Ernie Williams wrote home and explained that after they'd introduced themselves to each other, one of those somewhere, I don't know how this happened, but the British had a soccer ball in the trench. And they got the soccer ball out, and the Germans and British played soccer for quite a while in no man's land between the trenches. And if I'd been a little more energetic, I thought of it, but I also knew that everything had been cleared away for the Christmas program, so it was a little more difficult to use the projector. I would have brought you pictures. But somebody took a picture of the soldiers playing soccer, and there's a photo of, the Germans with their spiky helmets and the British with their outfits out playing soccer, having a great time. Let's see. German Lieutenant Kurt Zemisch was a school teacher, and he spoke both English and German, and he described the soccer game in his diary that was just discovered in 1999. The way he says it is, eventually the British brought a soccer ball from somewhere, and pretty soon a lively game ensued. How marvelously and wonderful, yet how strange it was. The English officers felt the same way. True Christmas, the celebration of love, managed to bring mortal enemies together as friends for a time. After somewhere in January or later, the high command wasn't so enthused because this wasn't getting anywhere as far as advancing the aims of the war on either side. But they concluded that as many as 100,000 soldiers had stopped the war. That's a lot, if you think about it, from miles down the trenches. And then somebody found, whether this is true or not, or whether it's legend, there was one German soldier who somehow went to the front during this time and discovered that there was no war. Instead, the Germans invited the British to their side because they had Christmas trees, and they had lit their Christmas trees and so on, and they exchanged gifts. They didn't have a lot, but it says they exchanged chocolate, cigarettes, soup, clothing, and a lot of them exchanged names and addresses so they could get together after the war, thinking that it wouldn't last all that long. Anyway, one young German soldier showed up and was aghast and began to lecture the German soldiers, saying such a thing should not happen in wartime. Have you German soldiers no sense of honor? And that young sergeant's name was Adolf Hitler, interestingly. Didn't happen again. But it was amazing that just the idea of Christmas, I can't find it in all these papers here, but one German soldier said, we're all human beings, and it's the day of peace. Today we'll have peace, tomorrow we have the war. And the soldiers all celebrated Christmas together. You might say it's the spirit of Christmas. Even now, you think of that, right? Christmas is a time of peace and calm. And I just thought I'd point that out from the song here, right? That's, I think, one reason that Silent Night's probably, the favorite Christmas carol of all time. But a few, the emotion or the scene that it creates is one of peace. Just think, all is calm, all is bright. The infant is tender and mild. The infant sleeps in heavenly peace. You don't even have to go to the rest verses before you picture a gentle, quiet, peaceful scene. The scene is one of peace. And I guess as the German soldiers were singing this song, it struck them. And They and the British celebrated a time of peace at Christmas. Well, next we got to go back about 2,000 or maybe 2,200 years or so to another time where there was a war. And in those days, it was King Ahaz. I don't know how much you know about your kings of Israel and Judah, but Ahaz was Hezekiah's father. And there'd been a string of fairly godly kings. King Uzziah, King Jotham, however you say, and so forth. But Ahaz, he didn't really follow God. He got interested in the way of the world. And he faced some difficulty. The king of Israel and the king of Syria, we'll call it for the time being. I guess what I should do is probably take you to 2 Kings, maybe 16, if I'm not mistaken. Let's see if I can find it here. I had things organized at one point, but yeah, 2 Kings chapter 16. Ahaz faced a problem. The king of Israel, the northern king, which was King Pekah, and we'll call it Syrian, the Arameans over in Damascus, were upset with King Ahaz, and they attacked. And King Ahaz was quite alarmed. He thought of different things, but it says he was quite afraid. And the two kings, King Rezin of the Syrians or the Arameans and the king of Israel, had besieged him in Jerusalem. And during that time, Isaiah the prophet came to King Ahaz. And let's see here. I'll take you now to Isaiah chapter 7, because that's where we hear Isaiah's words. 2 Kings 16 tells kind of the story. He decided not really to follow this advice, and he decided to hire the king of the Assyrians to help him, which they did. And he kind of went wrong from there. Didn't really work so well. But God knew that King Ahaz and the people in Jerusalem were in trouble, and verse 3 of Isaiah chapter 7 says, the Lord said to Isaiah, "Go out with your son," and I won't even attempt to pronounce the name, but his son, "to meet Ahaz at the end of the conduit of the upper pool." This was the water, some sort of a water system there they had in Jerusalem. And if you remember King Hezekiah, he greatly improved the water system, but apparently Ahaz started it. And God says to Isaiah, "Go and tell King Ahaz, calm down and be quiet. Don't be afraid or cowardly because of these two smoldering sticks. Don't be afraid of the fierce anger of King Rezin and the son of Remaliah, which is King Pekah." So God's words through Isaiah were, don't worry. King Ahaz was worried. And God goes on to say, and the reason don't worry is for both Aram and Ephraim, which is the kingdom of the kingdom of Israel, even though they've plotted against you and said, let's go up to Judah and terrorize it, this is what the Lord God says. It will not happen. It will not occur. The chief city of the Arameans is Damascus, and the chief of Damascus is Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim too will be shattered. Will be too shattered to be a people. Let's see if I can read the words right. The chief city of Ephraim, which is the northern kingdom of Israel, is Samaria, and the chief of Samaria is the son of Remaliah, King Pekah. If you do not stand firm in your faith, then you will not stand at all. And then the Lord spoke again to Ahaz, said, ask a sign from the Lord your God. It could be as deep as Sheol or as high as the heaven. Ahaz replied, I will not ask, I will not test the Lord. Well, on the surface, That's a good point. God had said through Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, don't put your Lord God to the test. And Jesus quotes that advice or that direction when he's being tempted of the devil. And so you might think, oh, well, Ahaz is giving a spiritually correct answer, but not really. When it gets down to it, Ahaz didn't want to bother with God. He actually wanted to kind of do things his own way. But Isaiah replied to Ahaz and said, listen, is it not enough for you to try the patience of men? Will you also try the patience of God? So you can see that Ahaz's answer wasn't necessarily a spiritually motivated one. It was he just didn't want to bother with God. Isaiah says in verse 13, will you also try the patience of God? Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. See, the virgin will conceive, have a son, and name him Emmanuel. By the time he learns to reject what is bad and choose what is good, he will be eating curds and honey. For before the boy knows how to reject what is bad and choose what is good, the land of the two kings that you fear will be abandoned. The Lord will bring you, your people, and your father's house. Such a time has never been seen since the northern kingdom of Israel separated from Judah. On that day, the Lord, and it goes on from there, and I won't read this because we got to keep moving. You've heard that text before, or that prediction before, but notice it has two fulfillments, like a lot of prophecy in a way. The sign that God himself gives is before someone who is born now is very old, those kingdoms you fear will be gone. It's a promise of protection and deliverance. It's a promise that even though things look awful right now, because, Ahaz had these two powerful kingdoms besieging his capital city, even though things look awful now, God says, I won't let it happen. And in a short time, they will just wither as kingdoms. And in fact, Assyria conquered both of them shortly as time went along. But notice the sign. See, the virgin will conceive, have a son, and name him Emmanuel. Emmanuel, right? We all know that means God with us. Or in Hebrew, it's actually with us, God, because they say things kind of backwards. But you can look at it in the name. Emmanuel is with us or next to us or close to us. El, of course, refers to God. God is close to us. God is with us. The real point is that with God, the people were safe. Now, Ahaz ran off and he made an alliance. He ingratiated himself with the king of Assyria to get some help. And ultimately, the city was saved. I guess Ahaz's faith wasn't too strong. It's a shame. His son Hezekiah, of course, was a lot more true to God. And later, when the king of Assyria came, Ahaz, relies entirely on God. I love the picture there. There's a letter that the king of Assyria sends saying, listen, nothing can save you now. And Hezekiah feels that's a real affront to God, so he takes the letter into the temple and he spreads it out before God. God, of course, is sitting on his throne on the mercy seat in the temple. And so king goes in and says, look at the letter they wrote about you, God. It's bad stuff. And God defeats the Assyrians. But Ahaz didn't go that way. He kind of wanted to do his own thing. That solved Ahaz's problem. God brought him some peace in spite of himself, to some degree. God brought him peace in spite of himself, more for the sake of the nation than for Ahaz himself. But the next time we hear about this Emmanuel, it's in Matthew. So this brings us to Matthew. We gotta fast forward 700 years or so, and it brings us to Matthew, book of Matthew. Oops, here we go. Matthew chapter 1. You might want to turn over there. And that might seem more appropriate for this season. Matthew chapter 1. Matthew's describing the birth of Jesus. And he describes, you know the story, and to try to keep an eye on time here, I won't read the story, but Matthew makes a point that, Joseph was engaged to a woman, and before they were married, turned out she was pregnant. And of course that caused trouble then, just like it would cause trouble now. It caused a family crisis of sorts. And Joseph decided, even though I've been had here and betrayed, I'm just going to, quietly move on and not make a big fuss, and I'm not going to humiliate Mary by rights. He could have had her stoned, but he decided not to. And it says, he was a righteous man. He was gracious. And but then an angel says to Joseph, "Listen, Joseph, don't worry. This is part of the plan. You can proceed. Mary hasn't betrayed you." And that's it. That's all he tells us. Then he moves on in verse 22 of Matthew chapter 1. It says, "Now all this took place to fulfill what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet Isaiah. See, the virgin will become pregnant and give birth to a son, and they will name him Emmanuel," which is translated, God is with us, or God with us, or God is close to us. Times were similar to the times of Ahaz, really, in a way. The world was in a time where people serving God had almost become extinct. There weren't very many, which you find out as we consider more about how, the times when Jesus was born. And last week, Pastor Hoseas was pointing out, what were the condition of the religious leaders and the people when the wise men came? Well, they weren't really too connected with God at all. Similar to the time of Ahaz, but similarly, God decided to take steps to be with his people in spite of the people. Now, here's a good time to, as a little bit of an aside here, it's time of Christmas, and so it's time, to look over Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 1 and 2, and I guess Matthew 1 and 2 and Luke 1 and 2 that describe the events around Jesus being born. And there's a lot of legend and so forth that has kind of sprung up around it. Think of this. Matthew tells the story almost entirely from Joseph's perspective. We find what Joseph was thinking, his conundrum when he found out his fiancée was already pregnant, and what he had to do about it. And the angel came and talked to him and his struggles there. And then we move on, and it says, the next thing that we're told is that wise men came. And then after that, an angel appeared to Joseph again and told him to go to Egypt. And after that, and so forth, and all the way down. So interestingly, you get the notion that Matthew must have had a moment to talk with Joseph. And he got the story from Joseph, because we hear it all from Joseph's perspective. Matthew also has a purpose I want to call your attention to. Matthew's purpose in all of this is not necessarily to give us an accurate history. Matthew's purpose is to prove to us in kind of a legal fashion that Jesus is the prophesied Messiah. Notice how he goes about the story. He starts with a genealogy, which if you're Jewish, is super duper important. Everything depends on the genealogy. So he starts with a genealogy and he massages it a little bit to really make his point. The next thing he does is he tells us about this episode where, well, Joseph has a fiancée and she becomes pregnant and so forth. But he doesn't really get into a lot of detail. Verse 22 gives us the reason. He tells us, now all this took place to fulfill what was spoken of the prophet. Now he gives us another snippet. He says, well, beginning of chapter 2, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and he doesn't even tell us, Luke does, but he doesn't tell us how they wound up in Bethlehem or anything else. What he says, though, is wise men came. And the wise men were inquiring around Jerusalem and so forth. And that got the city in a whole stir. Why does he tell us that story? Well, he wants to get right to verse 5, which is, because this is what is written by the prophet. And he tells us what the prophet says. And when he finishes with that, he goes on to tell us a little bit about the wise men. They, after they hear that, Herod sends them off to find baby Jesus, and they go and they bring him his gifts, and then they go on back to their home country because they've been warned by a dream. They're out of the way because we've made the point that it aligns with prophecy. And after the wise men had gone away, in verse 13, he tells us something else. Oh, Joseph had a dream. Take the child and flee to Egypt. The reason he tells us that, if you notice, he wants to get to verse 15, which he says, Joseph and his family stayed there until Herod's death in Egypt, so that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled. Out of Egypt I've called my son. The point of the stories, interestingly, is not so much to give us an accurate history so that we can know the story. The point is to say, hey, this stuff happened, and look, it aligns with prophecy. And he goes on. After that, Herod gets upset because his scheme is defeated. And he sends his soldiers to, what do we call it now? Infanticide, right? He kills off all the infants around Bethlehem. And that's a horrible story, but that isn't really Matthew's point. The point was to say, verse 17, then that which was spoken through the prophet was fulfilled. And so Matthew's point in the whole telling the story is not so much to tell the story, but to point out that a lot of it aligned with prophecy as Matthew has found it, reading through the Old Testament. And then he tells us the rest of it. By and by Herod died and this and that, and the angel told Joseph to go back to Israel. And look at verse 23 of Matthew 2. Then he, Joseph, went and settled in a town called Nazareth to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. So if you go through, there's a little bit of a story. Hey, it aligns with prophecy. A little bit of a story, it aligns with prophecy on through. Matthew's main point is, in telling us the story of Jesus' birth, is really to point out that Jesus fulfills the prophecies of the Messiah, because there was a lot of doubt in those days. And he wants to make that point. And he talked to Joseph. Now Luke, on the other hand, talked to Mary. Probably Joseph had passed away. Who knows? You don't hear of Joseph later, but we do know that Mary was there when Jesus died, and Mary was there after Jesus died. And so Luke had a chance to talk with Mary, and he heard the story from Mary. And so he tells it through Mary's eyes and Mary's experience. And he tells in great detail the story about Mary's cousin Elizabeth. And Mary went and spent a lot of time with Elizabeth. So she knows everything that happened to Zechariah and Elizabeth. And I won't recount all of that. That's the birth of John the Baptist. I'll say this, though. I don't mean to be super dismissive of the Christmas story. Only to say is we shouldn't get too stuck on any of the details, because the story is told to make a bigger picture. It also gives us little glimpses of God's personality. He goes and has an angel talk to the shepherds, and the angels talk to, here in Luke's version of it, he has people ready to welcome Jesus who have been following him. Here's one that I kind of like, which speaks to modern times. If you read through Luke, and so an angel, Zechariah, John's father, is a priest, and he's at the temple on duty, offering incense at the time of prayer, and an angel shows up to talk to him. And the angel of the Lord shows up and says, okay, Zechariah, good news, you're going to have a son. And tells him some things. He will bring many of the people, back to God, because not too many people are following God, just like in the time of Ahaz. And he will go on in the spirit and power of Elijah, and so forth. Now, Zechariah hears all this, and he's never seen an angel before in the temple. And so Zechariah asks the angel, how can I be sure of this? I'm an old man, and my wife is old too. And I love this answer. I love this answer because you get a little picture. I used to think Gabriel was indignant, but just listen to what Gabriel says here in verse 19. The angel said to Zechariah, I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and tell you this good news. Listen, you will be silent and not be able to speak until the day this happens, because you did not believe my words. So if you have any doubt about what Zechariah was thinking, Gabriel clears it up for us. Zechariah didn't believe him. He plain old didn't believe him. And the angel recognizes that. But just for a minute, picture you're standing there and you could hear Gabriel. Zechariah says, I don't know. This sounds impossible to me. And Gabriel, you can see him kind of shaking his head a little bit. Not only that, I am Gabriel. Now, who's Gabriel? Gabriel's the one who gave the prophecy about this to Daniel. And so Zechariah has read of Gabriel. So when Gabriel says, I am Gabriel, that should have jarred Zechariah. Oh, I've read about you, Gabriel. I am Gabriel. And furthermore, I stand in the very presence of God. And I've been sent to speak to you and tell you this good news. But in saying that, remember, I don't think Gabriel is proud, though he's a mighty being. My first thought is Gabriel's indignant. He's like, you don't believe this? I'm Gabriel. I came from God. What do you mean you don't believe it? But I don't think so. I think Gabriel is actually just puzzled. Because where Gabriel lives and works in the very presence of God, we don't have any disbelief, and whatever God says happens. There's no question. It's not even possible to contemplate that something that God says won't happen. Because where Gabriel lives and works, whatever God says happens. As God says it will. And so I think Gabriel is more just puzzled, like, well, I can see him, hesitating a little bit. You don't believe it. That's impossible. That's amazing. I think Gabriel's amazed. And so he says the only thing he can, it's very factual. I'm Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God. And, where I come from, it just happens. Who are you? I guess in modern language, vernacular, you might hear on the street, it'd be like, so Zechariah, what are you smoking? How could you even think that it wouldn't happen? Right. Zechariah had Abraham and Sarah as an example of older folks. Well, not only that, we have many examples. We have Samson's parents. Whenever God's about to do something, he often does it through barren women who miraculously conceive. But in any event, so you hear Gabriel, you get a little picture there of Gabriel, the angel, confronting disbelief maybe for the first time and thinking, wow, what they told me about these humans is right. These guys are nuts. But the story goes on, and Gabriel, maybe goes back and refreshes himself in heaven for a bit, and then he's on to talk with Mary a while later. And so Gabriel shows up later on in Luke here, and he says, it's actually 6 months later. 6 months of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary. The angel showed up and said, "Greetings to you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you." And Mary was greatly troubled and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. I'd be a little bit distressed too if an angel showed up and began speaking with me. And he says, "Don't be afraid. You found favor with God. You will conceive, give birth to a son, and you're to call him Jesus." I don't know what happened to Emmanuel, but we're going to call him Jesus. Or in Hebrew, Yeshua or Yeshua. "He will be great and called the Son of the Most High. The Lord will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end." Well, Gabriel had described this kingdom that never ends to Daniel hundreds of years before, 600 years roughly or so before. He'd explained the vision of the stone that came, right, which is Jesus, and sets up a kingdom that never ends. So he's telling Mary 600 years later, hey, he's here, he's going to set up a kingdom that will never end. Mary asks something different. Notice the key change in what she says. How will this be? Do you remember what Zacharias said? How can I be sure of this? Or how can this be? Mary asks something different. She doesn't doubt that it will be. She's just recognizing that there's a practical problem. How will this be? Mary asked Gabriel, since I'm a virgin. She just says, well, Gabriel, it's a great story, but you've got a problem. And Gabriel answers, and this time he's not so shocked or incredulous. He thinks, oh, okay, that's an honest question. I can see why you're puzzled, Mary. He says, well, the Holy Spirit will come, and that's how it's going to happen, Mary. That's why the one to be born will be called the Son of God. Even Elizabeth is going to have a child in her old age, because with God, nothing is impossible. That's what he wanted to say to Zechariah, I guess, But he explains it to Mary. And Mary just says, well, I'm the Lord's servant. May your word be fulfilled. And the angel went on his way. Interesting contrast between belief and unbelief there in Luke. So we get a little bit of a human interest story. We learn a little bit about Gabriel. Luke goes on and he tells the story, and he tells us in somewhat more detail about the shepherds who were in Bethlehem. He explains why it is that Mary and Joseph were in Bethlehem in the first place, since they came from Nazareth. He tells us about Simeon and Anna when they go to dedicate Jesus in the temple. He tells it all through Mary's eyes. I want to read, though, something. After John the Baptist was born, Zechariah was filled with the Holy Spirit and prophesied. These are words here at the end of Luke chapter 1. He says, and you, my child, will be called a prophet of the Most High, verse 76 of Luke chapter 1. You will go before the Lord to prepare the way for him, to give his people the knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of their sins, because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven, to shine on those living in darkness and in the shadow of death, and to guide our feet into the path of peace. It can take that peace a lot of ways. But let's move on, because we hear some more words. Let's see. When Joseph and Mary take Jesus to the temple over in Luke chapter 2, they run into Simeon, who'd been looking for the Messiah. And in verse 30 and on here, he says, for my eyes have seen your salvation. You have prepared it in the presence of all people, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and glory to your people Israel. Matthew and Luke tell us a little bit of the story, but notice something. Mark doesn't really mention anything about it. He just starts off with the fact that John the Baptist was preaching, and he brings Jesus on the scene. And John, in John chapter 1, condenses the entire arrival of Jesus down to just one. Let's see if I can find it here. I don't know. He condenses it all down to just one verse, one sentence. And he, in John chapter 1, he starts off with the Word was God, the Word was with God, and so forth. And by the time he gets down to verse 14, he summarizes the arrival of Jesus in kind of very, very succinct terms, which is, God arrived and dwelt among men. Let's see what it says here. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father. That's it. Covers the whole story in that one sentence. Because for John, that's what was important. God came to make his dwelling among us. That brings us to really the point of all of this. Into our scripture reading. Let's just, Galatians is Paul's version of the Christmas story. Once again, making it very, very succinct. I guess I handed all my programs out, and that has the scripture reading on it. But, when the fullness of time was come, when it was the right time, according to the prophecies, when it was the right time, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. And the purpose was to save people. He got it down to one sentence as well. Because the whole purpose of the Christmas story is part of a bigger story. The story is that God has always wanted to be with us, with human beings. It started that way in Eden. Every day, however long it lasted, but every day, God came and walked with Adam and Eve and spent time with them. When finally he rescues the Israelites from Egypt and gets them out there gathered around the bottom of Mount Sinai, he tells them to build, or he tells Moses, to have the people build the tabernacle. And in Exodus 25, he says, make a dwelling for me among the people so that I may come and dwell among them. He wanted to be with them, and he was with them, and we had the pillar of fire by night and the pillar of cloud by day, representing his continued presence with his people. And later, David's great ambition was to build a temple so that God could dwell among his people. And when Solomon dedicates it, he makes the same claim. Now you've got a place to live among your people. And honoring the effort and the thought that David and Solomon had put into it, at that moment the temple was filled with the presence of God to show that there he was, dwelling among his people. He'd always wanted to dwell among his people, and here's, I don't know if I can find it, but his dream, God's dream, Jesus' dream, is in the future, and you find it here in Revelation 21. Let's see if I can skip down here. Well, we'll just read the first few verses. Revelation 21, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. You've heard this before. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people. He will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. And we'll just stop there. You can see the consistency of purpose from the beginning of the book to the end. God's been trying to dwell with his people. The problem is that people haven't always been too good about having him live with them. In fact, they've been downright hostile most of the time. In fact, when Adam and Eve sinned, no longer could God come and walk with them in the evening. They could talk with him, but it was broken. There was a problem. Adam and Eve had chosen Satan as their leader. It wasn't God so much anymore. That problem persisted through the flood. It persisted, but God had a plan all along. That's what Paul speaks of there in Galatians, that there was a plan, and elsewhere in Corinthians and Romans, he makes the point that the plan had been made since before the earth was created. The plan was somehow God was going to fix the brokenness so he could dwell among us. I just read your Revelation. His plan is he will dwell among those who choose to be with him. In the end, he's going to get his wish. He can dwell among his people. His arrival on earth, the Christmas story, was the first step. It wasn't just a nice, comforting story. It isn't really a human interest story about people who couldn't find a guest room and, a poor lady who ended up having to deliver her child while in the midst of a long and arduous trip. I'm sure that was unpleasant for Mary, but that isn't the point. The point was that it's a step in a bigger story. We can learn a few things about the fact that it's a step for a bigger story. I'm just going to read you a few things that were written in the New Testament about it here. Here's Hebrews chapter 10. I'll read you just a section. Therefore, when Christ came into the world, he said, "Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you prepared for me with burnt offerings and sin offerings. You were not pleased. And then I said," Christ speaking, "Here I am. It is written about me in the scroll. I have come to do your will, my God." First he said sacrifices and offerings were not, you were not pleased, even though they had been offered in accordance with the law of Moses. And then Christ says, "Here I am, I have come to do your will." He sets aside the offerings to establish his arrival. And by that will, we have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus. Day after day, the priests do their duties in the temple. But the ceremonies in the temple could never take away sin. But when the priest had offered for all time that one sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God. And since that time, he waits for his enemies to be made his footstool. For by the one sacrifice, he has made perfect forever those who are being made holy. You can see that Jesus had a plan. He had a plan to arrive on this earth. And his plan was to save people from their sin, to restore the relationship. Here's another view Paul writes over in Philippians 2. He says here in Philippians 2:5, "Have the same mind as Christ, who being in very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant and being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself, becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven, on earth, and under the earth, and that every tongue will acknowledge that Jesus is Lord." Christ had to humble himself and become a human being. That was an unbelievable change. It's hard to, we can't even fathom. I don't think anybody can fathom what that meant. To become a human being, to become a baby. Hebrews chapter 2 tells us more about the story. And it's also more about just how humble it was. Jesus had to become. Look what it says here. This is Hebrews 2, verses 9 and on. But we see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while. Can you imagine that? The commander of the angels, who was now made lower than the angels for a little while. Hard to figure out. You can try to think of analogies. The president of the United States goes out and, is the water boy for the soldiers in the trenches or something. But even that doesn't in any way capture the change that was taken. But we see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. In bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was fitting for God, for whom and through whom everything exists, that he should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through what he suffered. Both the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. He says, and he quotes here Isaiah, I will declare your name to my brothers and sisters in the assembly. I will sing your praises. I'm going to skip down to verse 14 here. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity so that by his death he might break the power of him that holds the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. For surely it is not angels he helps, he being Jesus, but Abraham's descendants. For this reason he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. So you have the Creator who is not ashamed to be called the brothers and sisters of the rebellious people who have sinned on earth. Jesus had a plan. It wasn't really the story about the manger. He had a plan to come and rescue people. Isaiah, long before it happened, these are things from the New Testament, Isaiah in chapter 9, shortly after he gave his reassurance to Ahaz there, who was trembling in his boots, he goes on here, and in chapter 9, Isaiah, carries on, and part of Isaiah 9 is sung in the musical production of the Messiah. Here's what God through Isaiah says, Nevertheless, there'll be no more gloom for those who were in distress. That's us. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, but in the future, he will honor them among the nations by the way of the sea beyond Jordan. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. And Matthew quotes that to once again prove that Jesus was the Messiah. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoiced at the harvest, as warriors rejoiced when dividing the plunder. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them. You being Jesus, them being us. You have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of the oppressor. Every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning, will be fuel for the fire. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. Here's Isaiah writing in chapter 61. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and a release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and to provide for those who grieve, and to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. God had a plan long before, and the arrival of Jesus was God's execution of the plan. His plan was to bring hope, to bring relief from suffering, and to bring a way where everybody could spend for eternity with him. That was his plan. And that's the origination of the Christmas spirit, if you think of it. We speak of the spirit of a Christmas, and you can buy books that have like really heartwarming stories of selfless, kind, generous things that have happened at Christmas, or a special favor that was shown somewhere. Today, even in a pretty godless society, people still recognize that's the spirit of Christmas. That's what I pointed out in my story about the army there in 1914, that the spirit of Christmas is one of generosity, one of kindness. That's why everybody asks for donations, right? That's why you see the Salvation Army people out ringing their bells at Christmas time, because people are generous at Christmas time. It's a spirit of selflessness. What struck me is that it originates with God. I've tried to paint the picture that God had a plan of complete selflessness to rescue human beings. And that was his plan at Christmas. That was the beginning of his plan. Just like I believe that the spirit of creativity or the talent or the whatever in human beings, where human beings appreciate music and art and designing beautiful things, comes from God. No other creature has it. That's why it says we're made in God's image. I believe that the spirit of Christmas came from God, and it's been handed down, even though it's been 2,000 years. That spirit is still prevalent amongst people, not because people came up with it, but because it was originated by God. God made the first move when Jesus arrived on earth. His was a move, as I've just read to you. He was looking to, relieve those oppressed, comfort those who mourn, save those who are in a dark and oppressed way, slaves of the devil. The spirit of Christmas originated with God. Notice that, God he made the move not in response to what people were doing, but of his own volition. Think of this. Jesus came to this earth, albeit born of Mary there in Bethlehem, but he came to this earth right on time, no matter the state of his people and their belief, no matter the state of the religious leaders, no matter whether they were ready. He had a plan. He made his move. When he said he was going to make it, he was faithful. He reached out to people even though they weren't ready. The nativity story